Professor Stephen Zunes has come here virtually off of a plane, I understand. So we're really, really happy that you were able to come. Each speaker will give a presentation, and then we will open it up for questions and comments. I think this is so people should hold their questions and comments until after both speakers have had a chance to present. So first, Larry. Larry Everest is the author of Oil, Power, and Empire. He is a writer for Revolution newspaper. He's Oil, Power, and Empire, the U.S., the Iraq, and the U.S. Global Agenda. Please welcome Larry Everest.
Thank you. 2 days ago, Sunday, the carrier strike group Abraham Lincoln, which included the carrier Lincoln, the guided missile cruiser Cape St. George, 2 guided missile destroyers, the Momsen and Sterret, along with the British destroyer Albion and French warship La Pique, sailed through the Straits of Hormuz, right here, into the Persian Gulf, passing a few miles from the Iranian coast. The single aircraft carrier air wing on the Abraham Lincoln includes 90 warplanes. One analyst noted that this is a larger and more capable air force than the entire air force of many American allies. And of course, by capable, he means destructive. The Navy neither confirms nor denies the presence of nuclear weapons on board U.S. carriers. Meanwhile, another strike group, carrier strike group, the Carl Vinson, is in the nearby Arabian Sea. It's right over here. And the John C. Stennis may still be in the area. It was in the Persian Gulf a few weeks ago. The next day, that's Monday, the European Union imposed the most stringent sanctions yet on Iran, targeting its oil industry and its banking sector. And earlier today, Britain warned that it could further deploy troops to the Gulf if Iran followed through on a threat to shut the Straits of Hormuz if its oil shipments were cut off. So this show of force was aimed at warning Iran not to interfere with the waterway through which 20% of the world's oil flows, even as the United States and Europe were attempting to cut off Iran's oil lifeline, for which it's dependent on over half its government revenues, and to effectively cripple Iran's economy. So how is the media, let's step back and look at overall how the media is treating this, because I think it's important for us to be able to go out and break through the basic kind of picture that people get in the media. Let's take Joel Brinkley in a column a couple days ago in the Chronicle. He began his article, quote, "Blustering and fuming, Iran seems to be spoiling for war." I'm not making this up, by the way. Last Sunday, Iran issued a stark warning to its neighbors not to help the U.S. in the boycott, and then said, Brinkley, Iran set off the strident talk of war. What about the New York Times today? It quoted a statement by Britain's Prime Minister Cameron, a joint statement, German Chancellor Merkel and French President Sarkozy, quote, "Iran is so far has had no regard for its international obligations and is already exporting and threatening violence around its region." And this is the kind of framework that is routinely spelled out without question in the U.S. media and the media of France, Britain, and the other capitalist country. But what's missing from the picture? There's no mention here of the fact that the United States recently invaded and occupied Iran's 2 closest neighbors, Afghanistan and Iraq. Nor is there any mention of the fact that this very moment the United States is taking military action recently in Libya, also in Somalia, Yemen, Pakistan, ongoing in Afghanistan. It's supporting brutal repression in Gaza and in Bahrain, and of course we could probably go on much longer. But nonetheless, it's Iran that's threatening violence. Missing is the fact that the U.S. and Israel are already waging what's being reported as a covert war against Iran that involves assassinations, mysterious explosions at military bases, cyber warfare, drone overflights, and a new U.S. commando team operating near Iran. Yet Iran is supposedly threatening violence. I don't hear an open debate in the Iranian parliament or in Iranian society about attacking the United States, yet in the U.S., this question is very openly debated. Foreign Policy, Foreign Affairs, the leading foreign policy journal in the United States, this month had not one, but two articles calling for, quote, "Time to attack Iran. Why a strike is the least bad option." You know, another, why Obama should take out Iran's nuclear program. And what would the response be here if a leading Iranian politician sang a tune, "Bomb, Bomb, Bomb Iran, the United States," to the tune of Barbara Ann, as is done here by John McCain? That's a joke, right? But Iran is the purveyor of violence. Missing is the fact that the U.S. spends about 100 times more on its military than Iran, that it has 1,000 military bases around the world, that Iran's gross domestic product is smaller than the state of Massachusetts, and that the U.S. war fleet is operating 6,500 miles from its shore and sailing closer to Iran's coast than the Farallon Islands, which, by the way, you can see on a clear day from here. They're 27 miles out. But we're trained that this is business as usual to have the U.S. military all over the world threatening military action. In fact, the Fifth Fleet stated the Abraham Lincoln completed a regular and routine passage through the state. And it's true. The U.S. military domination of the globe is regular and routine. But why should anyone who cares about humanity just stop and think, why should we accept this state of affairs as normal and good? It's treated here as white noise. It's just background noise. Oh, of course they're in the Middle East. What right does the U.S. have to impose its will violently around the world? What about the nuclear weapon? Now, supposedly all this is about nuclear weapons, sanctions, the threats, and so on. According to the Times today, it's to, quote, impairs Iran's ability to finance its illegal nuclear program. Western politicians, according to the Times, believe that Iran is building a nuclear weapons capability. Well, what's missing here? One, the U.S. government doesn't know that Iran is building a nuclear weapons program. In fact, a consensus of 16 intelligence agencies in 2007 found that we judge with high confidence that in the fall 2003, Tehran halted its nuclear weapons program, and there's been nothing that's reversed that. Two, you'd never know that all nuclear sites in Iran are routinely inspected and there's been nothing amiss found. Number three, while the New York Times reports that this new report by the International Atomic Energy Agency found, quote, Iran's nuclear program has a military objective, is actually a lie. The IAEA report, and this is the Washington Post, does not say Iran has a bomb, nor does it say it's building one, only that its multi-year effort pursuing nuclear technology is sophisticated and broad enough that it could be consistent with building a bomb. And 4, here's the big picture. Iran's a non-nuclear third world country. The United States is the only country to have ever used nuclear weapons twice, murdering 150,000 to 240,000 in the initial days after Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It remains the world's biggest nuclear power with 4,000 nuclear weapons. It's never renounced first use. And nuclear weapons, it's not getting rid of its nuclear weapons, it's upgrading them in this new nuclear strategy so they're quote unquote more effective. And it backs the only country in the region that does have nuclear weapons, the state of Israel, with 150 to 200, maybe more nuclear weapons. Why isn't this reported? And Joel Brinkley also says sanctions are an alternative to war. We don't need to, he says Iran-U.S. war unnecessary, sanctions working. Well, we saw in Iraq during the 1990s, not only were sanctions not an alternative to war, they prepared for war by isolating, weakening, and vilifying an opponent. And it's probably the case that more people were killed in Iraq by sanctions than the wars. Perhaps 1.9 million from sanctions during the 1990s. The through line here is that the media is systematically training people to see their interests through the eyes of the empire, through the eyes of the emperor, as if that corresponded to their interests and the interests of humanity. And even tonight, I just caught a minute of Obama. We want to make America number one. You know, who's we, white man? I mean, really. You know, to quote Tonto, the joke about the Lone Ranger and Tonto. And they're training people in the notion that only American lives count. And the fact of the matter is, whether or not Iran's pursuing nuclear technology, this narrative is turning reality upside down. Nothing good can come from anything the U.S. is doing in the region. And if people understood this, every time they thought about global affairs and all the different things that the United States claims it's doing when it's going around the world, we would be much, much further along toward people really understanding the realities and doing something about it. The essence of what exists in the U.S. is not democracy, but capitalism, imperialism, and political structures to enforce that capitalism, imperialism. What the U.S. spreads around the world, for example, in the Middle East, is not democracy, but imperialism and political structures to enforce that imperialism. That's from Basics from the talks and writings of Bob Avakian. So very quickly, I want to try to get into, if not the nuclear issue, if not concern for the Iranian people, and you know, I understand I was in Iran when the Islamic Republic was founded, and it is a reactionary, murderous theocracy. But this clash is not about liberating the Iranian people or bringing freedom. The United States was fine with the Islamic Republic when it was murdering leftists, radicals, Democrats, and communists. No problem with that. So what is actually going on here? And I'm going to be brief. I really am appreciating Stephen being here after that's a very long plane ride from Asia. So he may have to go a little bit early, hopefully not, but we're going to try to be quicker than usual here. So what is behind this confrontation? First, the core issue for the U.S. and Israel has never been whether or not Iran actually had a nuclear weapon. The core issue has been, even the perception that Iran could conceivably at some point get a weapon threatens to undermine U.S. Israeli military freedom of action and its military domination of the region, which is a key pillar upon which they have built their dominance. Unquestioned military dominance in that region. That's why the U.S. can sail battleships and aircraft carriers all over the place without any sort of a challenge. So that's the nuclear issue. But it isn't the main factor. The main factor is a battle for regional dominance, a battle to contain, weaken, perhaps even overthrow Iran, because Iran poses an obstacle to unfettered U.S. regional hegemony. The war on terror did not work out for the U.S. as planned. The U.S. planned to begin in Iraq and Afghanistan and restructure this entire region, overthrowing 7 governments within 5 years, starting with Iraq and then moving right on to Iran, but also Syria, Libya, and others. But instead, what's happened is that Iran has actually gained strength through this. And if you look across the region, there's sort of a covert war going on between the United States and its allies, including Saudi Arabia and Israel, for influence in Iraq, for influence in Syria, which is a close ally of Iran's, and one of the big reasons that the U.S. is trying to overthrow the Assad government, which is also a murderous government. Lebanon, Gaza, all over the region, and the honest imperialists will tell you this is a battle for whether or not the U.S. has unquestioned dominance, which they desperately need as a central part of their global power, particularly as they're being challenged in a rapidly shifting world by other powers such as Russia and particularly China. And what's happened is that because Iran has continued its nuclear program, because it has not caved into the United States, because it is a large country, the 3rd or 4th largest oil reserves, 80 million people, and a country that is an Islamist state, which poses a different model and a different sort of authority, reactionary authority to the U.S., because it's increasing its influence around the region, it is a problem for the United States imperialists, and especially because of these changes in the region and this continuation of its nuclear program, it is becoming an increasing concern for the U.S., especially because the uprisings in the Arab world are tilting the playing field in very unpredictable ways. You can look at some countries, it looks like the U.S. gets the upper hand. Libya, perhaps now Syria. In other countries, Iraq, it looks like Iran may be increasing its leverage. This is why, and I want to make the point quickly, and again, I'd like to, we can get into this more in the Q&A, that this is not a policy of a small section of the ruling class. This is not the Israel lobby twisting a few Congress people's arms. This is not simply the neocons. Control of the Middle East, where 60% of the world's oil resources are, and look at the map. This is a crossroads between Africa, Asia, and Europe. Enormous amounts of world trade go through here. This area has been contested in both world wars. It has great military strategic importance. This has been essential to the whole functioning of their system of global capitalism, which Obama can talk all he wants about American jobs. This capitalist economy runs by exploiting the labor resources and markets of billions of people around the world. That's how it functions, and profits off them and creates misery wherever it goes. That's what this empire rests on. And again, we can get into this more in the question and answer. I want to conclude by saying two things in light of all this. A war on Iran would be an enormous catastrophe. One estimate by the Union of Concerned Scientists said even a limited strike on the Bushehr nuclear facility could lead to over 100,000 deaths and expose millions in the area to high levels of radiation. There's actually an interesting essay by this former CIA agent, Philip Giraldi, what a war with Iran might look like. And he sort of runs out a scenario. One move leads to a counter move, to a counter move, to another move. And pretty soon, you're in a major war across the region. And no doubt, many hundreds of thousands of Iranians would suffer grievously. It's outrageous. So the first thing we need to do is resist. And on February 4th, there are leaflets on the back there. Maybe we should pass them out to everybody. There's about 30 or 40 groups across the country came together to call an emergency demonstration on the 4th. It will be at Powell and Market at noon. And a bunch of the different groups are going to be there. I hope everyone turns out, because one of the most essential things, we have to break out of this dynamic where the only choices people feel they have in the region and the world are either outmoded U.S. imperialism or outmoded Islamic fundamentalism. If you're for, if you hate fundamentalism, well, supposedly you should support the imperialists. If you hate the imperialists, supposedly you should support the fundamentalists. No. If you support either, you reinforce both. And for us to break through the middle on this, one thing is resistance across the ideological spectrum. The other thing is, as I've said, and again I'll get into this more in the discussion, the crisis, this escalation reveals tremendous vulnerability, and it reveals the need for a completely different economic and political system. I mean, this country has been in more wars. It seems like war's a constant state of affairs now, and it's just outrageous and intolerable. We need a revolution. We need a different political and economic system. That's the only way these wars are going to end. We've got to be real about that. And the Revolutionary Communist Party has a leader in Bobavakian and a strategy for revolution that's a real strategy for revolution. And there's an alternative for a visionary, a vibrant, a re-envisioned socialism. So the other thing I think it's crucial for people to do is find out about this, discuss it, and let's change the whole discourse in this society where we're grappling, where we're not trapped in choosing one oppressor or another, whether imperialism or a fundamentalist or a Democrat or a Republican or this right-winger versus this not quite so fascist right-winger, but a whole different world. And that's a discussion we urgently, urgently need to have. Thank you.
It has an article by Larry Everett on this, which he's drawing from tonight. And I don't have my paper, but I'm really pleased to welcome back to Revolution Books Professor Stephen Zunes. He is a professor of international studies and politics at the University of San Francisco and heads up the Middle Eastern Studies program. Please welcome him.
Thank you. It's good to be back. As Larry and I, freely recognize, we have different lines in a lot of areas. I'm not a communist, and et cetera. But no one, I find virtually nothing to disagree with whatsoever about your analysis of the U.S. Iranian situation. Indeed, no one who is intellectually honest, frankly, can come to any other conclusion about the situation there. So a lot of what I'm going to say overlaps somewhat, though it'll be a slightly different angle. Perhaps it won't be repetitious at all. But I want to start on two things. One is the nature of the regime, and one is U.S. Policy. Again, as I point out, we are talking about a reactionary regime by any measure. Despite Ahmadinejad's populist rhetoric and occasionally allocating some funds to shore up some support from various constituencies, he's no progressive. He has pursued a policy of privatization that rivals what the IMF has done in a lot of the countries. He's brutally crushed trade unions, the bus driver strike last year in particular. He has a social conservatism, that makes the Christian right in this country look moderate by comparison. And of course, the political repression, particularly against the left, has been very, very severe. There was a popular uprising in 2009 of liberals, leftists, moderate Islamists, and others that despite claims by the regime that the U.S. or Britain was behind it, this was a genuine popular uprising. Now, the U.S. has funded some opposition groups with the express goal of overthrowing the regime, but most of these are tied to exiles who have virtually no support inside the country. So that money, which Obama incidentally cut off when he came to office, has really it had no impact one way or the other on the uprisings. Indeed, this history of civil insurrections, goes back to the tobacco strike in the 1890s, the Constitutional Revolution of 1906, the overthrow of the Shah in 1979. Britain and the United States have nothing to teach the Iranians in terms of popular uprisings. U.S. has interfered in many ways, of course, overthrowing Mossadegh in 1953 and all sorts of other kind of sordid interventions, but these were in support of undemocratic minorities. We don't know the first thing about mobilizing popular majority movements. But what's important and interesting is that the neocons and other imperialists in this country wanted the Green Revolution crushed. That in many ways the likes of Ahmadinejad and the reactionary clerics play right into the hands of the conservatives. Indeed, they play off on each other. They need each other to justify the kinds of policies. The United States, advancement of imperialism in all the obvious ways. In terms of Iran, a lot of people don't. Everybody tries to emphasize the Islamic characteristics of Iran, but what's really kept the regime in power in many ways is this playing on the nationalist card. Indeed, the Iranians, the Persians are about the most nationalistic people in the entire world. And given the history of intervention, it is something that the regime can capitalize on when it hears these threats. In fact, one thing you don't hear about in the U.S. media is that the leaders of the movement that brought in hundreds of thousands of people out in the streets against the regime in 2009 support the government in its conflict with the United States. They support the government's right to develop nuclear power. They oppose U.S. intervention. This is something that really, you have a few, Ahmad Chalabi wannabes and that kind of folks among the exile community, particularly in L.A. But by and large, the opposition there is legitimate. There is nationalistic, and it includes many sectors of society and a range of ideological opinions. These are not puppets of U.S. imperialism. Now, again, as Larry pointed out, there are lots of negative things you can say about the regime, but that is not what U.S. policy is about. I mean, if it's certainly not about the repression and theocracy. I mean, it's pretty bad in Iran, to be sure, but it pales in comparison to Saudi Arabia. In terms of women's rights, religious minority rights, almost any measure you want to have. And of course, Saudi Arabia is a major U.S. ally, and we supply the instruments of repression to that regime. And it's not nuclear proliferation per se. Let me talk a little about the nuclear issue. Iran, in terms of nuclear reprocessing and other things that have led to these UN sanctions and other sanctions, is nothing that a couple of dozen other countries do normally. In fact, they are allowed to do these things under the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Now, there is something in the NPT that basically gives the International Atomic Energy Agency to impose special restrictions on certain countries as punishment if they violate certain guidelines. Indeed, Iran was caught with some relatively minor violations some years ago, and this was what was used to justify these additional sanctions. But it's interesting, even if you take the position, well, what's different about Iran's nuclear program is they're violating UN Security Council resolutions, et cetera, Well, guess what? You talk about Israel. Larry mentioned Israel, of course, which has a vast nuclear arsenal, the only country in the Middle East that does. But remember, just as close to Iran is Pakistan and India that have nuclear weapons. Well, a lot of people don't realize this, but there are also UN Security Council resolutions that are being violated by those countries. Look it up. UN Security Council Resolution 487 calls on Israel to place its nuclear facilities under the trusteeship of the International Atomic Energy Agency. But the U.S. has blocked that resolution from ever being enforced. Also look up UN Security Council Resolution 1172, which calls on Pakistan and India to eliminate their nuclear weapons and their long-range delivery systems. Now, not only has the United States blocked that resolution from being enforced as well, the United States has provided nuclear-capable jet fighters and other military equipment to Israel, Pakistan, and India, and we've even signed and Congress ratified a nuclear cooperation agreement with India in violation of a number of U.S. laws and international agreements. So, this is the old game of nuclear apartheid. This is not about non-proliferation. It's about the United States, believes it has the right to say which countries can have nuclear programs and which countries cannot. And even putting aside the obvious, political and moral and other kind of, hypocrisy and that kind of thing, even the most mainstream studies of non-proliferation will tell you that non-proliferation regimes will only work if they're law-based and if they're universal. You can't, again, it's not just hypocritical, it just doesn't work. Because why is Iran, let's assume that Iran really does want to have a nuclear weapons option. Now, all the evidence suggests they don't have a nuclear weapons program yet, but they are moving down the kind of research they're doing for their nuclear energy program could indeed, fork to a military direction fairly easily, and within a few years they could have one or two crude, Hiroshima type bombs. Let's and I hope they don't do that. I don't think any country should have nuclear weapons, but let's assume they do. They're not going to nuke Israel. Get real. It's a repressive, nasty regime, but they're not suicidal. Israel is a massive, nuclear deterrent, as is the United States and other allies. And by the way, Ahmadinejad, he's really hardcore. He's anti-Semitic. A lot of nasty things you can say about him. But he never said Israel should be wiped off the map. That idiom doesn't even exist in Farsi. What he was doing was quoting Ayatollah Khomeini from 20 years earlier. And actually, at that time, the United States and Israel were secretly supporting Khomeini, so he didn't bring it up at the time. But it was quoting something Ayatollah Khomeini said. And the more direct translation is the regime occupying Jerusalem should vanish from the pages of time. Okay? So vanish from the pages of time. So basically, and in fact, Ahmadinejad himself, in a later interview, clarified, look at the map. Do you see the Soviet Union anymore? It's not that the Soviet Union is physically destroyed. Is that it's a whole different country, a whole different political system. In other words, he's talking about a unified Palestine. He's not talking about physically killing the Jews. And he's talking about the regime occupying Israel. That is the government. Okay? So, but it's amazing how this quote has been not only misquoted initially, but said over and over and over again, even after Farsi speakers and others have pointed out that it was inaccurate. In any case, let's say Ahmadinejad it would be crazy enough to want to launch a first strike against Israel. In Iran, the president is not the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. He doesn't have that power. It's up to the Guardian Council, which is a committee, and committees, as a rule, don't tend to make crazy, provocative acts, especially those that could lead to their own country's destruction. Now, I need to tell you also a little bit about their nuclear program. Guess what country got Iran's nuclear program started in the first place? The United States in the 1950s, part of the Atoms for Peace program. And it went on and on through the Carter administration. In fact, in 1976, President Ford was asked to sign an agreement that would allow General Electric to sell 8 nuclear reactors to Iran. And Ford had the question, why does Iran, sitting on top of all this oil and natural gas, need nuclear power? And his advisor explained, well, when gas prices or oil prices are high, that you can actually by having more electrical generation through nuclear, you can sell more oil, and it actually brings back more money than it even costs to build the nuclear power plant. So economically, it makes certain sense. Guess who his 3 advisors were? It was his chief of staff, Dick Cheney, his Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld, and the guy who's the head of non-proliferation issues at the Arms Control Disarmament Agency, a guy by the name of Paul Wolfowitz. The very people who just not long afterwards started saying, oh, they must be make nuclear weapons. Why else would they need nuclear power since they're sitting on top of all this oil and natural gas? So let's again assume the Iranians want to have, again, let's assume the worst. Let's assume they do want to pursue a nuclear weapons option. If they were really dead set on doing this, they would have probably gotten it by now. But there's no sign they've had a Manhattan Project style, focus. This has been let's assume they're keeping that option open in the future. Why might they want to do that? Well, again, look. As I pointed out, their country to their immediate left has been invaded. Their country to their immediate right has been invaded. Iran itself is being threatened to attack. Now remember, Iran was listed on the axis of evil along with Iraq and North Korea. Well, Iraq got rid of its nuclear program, brought back in inspectors of the International Atomic Energy Agency, which confirmed they had eliminated their nuclear program. Guess what happened? They got invaded. Government overthrown, occupied. North Korea, by contrast, threw out the IAEA inspectors and started developing nuclear weapons. They're still in power. Now, if you're an Iranian, what lesson would you get from that? Maybe you need a nuclear deterrent. Now, personally, I don't think it's a very smart policy because it's just giving the imperialists an excuse, to isolate and attack, et cetera, et cetera. But still, there's a certain logic, to why they might want that option. So again, I want just to reiterate what Larry says. I mean, this is not just a sort of a kind of a good old-fashioned anti-imperialist conspiracy theory about why we're really going to Iran. Look at the national security statement where they talk about full spectrum dominance. They're quite explicit about this, that not only does the United States want to prevent the rise of another superpower rival, they want to prevent even a major regional power emerging. And that's what the threat is from Iran. Not that they're a threat to the United States directly, but They want to be recognized as a regional power, as Iran, formerly known as Persia, has been on and off for the past 2,500 years. And interesting, what Iran is the only country besides Saddam's Iraq that had the combination of a large educated population, sizable oil resources, and adequate water and other supplies that they could be self-sufficient. You see, nowadays, most countries can't go an independent line because of the International Monetary Fund, because the WTO, the global capitalist system kind of keeps them in line. But when you have all that oil and all other resources, and again, sizable educated population, countries like that, we can't control by more traditional, soft power ways. We got to get nasty. And that's really what we are seeing right now. So finally comes the question, will there be war? Now I differ from some people in that, and I may be naive here, and I may eat my words, but I don't think there's going to be actually a war. And I do this for several reasons. One is it's the benefit of the capitalists and others to prepare for war, but oftentimes actual war can mess things up pretty bad. And again, Iran has the power to close the Strait of Hormuz, at least for an extended period. This would not be just a strike against specific targets. We'd have to get rid of the anti-aircraft installation, command and control centers. We'd have to send commando groups in because you couldn't just destroy it from above. And even if you did, it still wouldn't destroy the nuclear program, because so much of it's underground, we don't know where all it is, et cetera, et cetera. And it would be a mess. And they have the power to disrupt the flow of oil out of the Persian Gulf region, where close to 60% of the world's oil supply flows. Now, can you imagine what that would do to the global economy? I mean, it wouldn't even be in the interest of capitalists for that to happen. It wouldn't help Obama's re-election chances either, because even though some people tend to rally around the flag during the war, the recession would just get far, far, far worse. And indeed, there's now a fair amount of evidence that Bush and Cheney really were planning for just such a massive attack on Iran. And the only reason they refused was that the generals and the admirals basically came to them, and they're already feeling smarter for not speaking out more against Iraq, which a lot of them thought was a poor idea. A lot of them thought that was a poor idea as well. They basically threatened to resign en masse if the U.S. tried to do something like that. That was really the only reason it was called off. And Obama, I can go on all day. If you look at my website, you can see how much I go on about my disappointments and criticisms of Obama's foreign policy. But at least Obama is reasonably intelligent. I really would like to think, and again, I may be naive here, but I'd like to think he recognizes what a disaster that would be. And again, it wouldn't just be closing the Strait of Hormuz, but Iran has a lot of allies out there, and Hezbollah and others, that could make a lot of hassle. In fact, the U.S. backed, in fact, not just U.S. backed, but U.S. instigated Israeli war in Lebanon in 2006. Was originally the idea was in preparation for a war in Iran, because even though Hezbollah had largely demobilized, focusing on being a social service network and its electoral politics, they'd gotten all this new rockets in from Iran to be a deterrent to knowing that there'd be an attack against Israel if there was a U.S. Attack against Iran. And so what Bush was pushed, initially reluctant Israeli government, to have that massive blitzkrieg in 2006. I don't think for a moment it had anything to do with the kidnapping of the Israeli soldiers. This has been planned back in May, long before that. But that was to wipe out this deterrent capability. Well, obviously it didn't go very, very well. In fact, it kind of underscored the limits of air power. If Hezbollah could hide their weapons, and still survive and still strike, and imagine what Iran could do. So. That's just kind of aside. What I'm saying is that just logistically, I mean, even putting aside the legal, moral, political, et cetera, logistically, an attack on Iran really would not make sense. Could Israel do something on its own? I don't think so. The U.S. really does control the skies in the area. We provide Israel with virtually all its needs, and I have little doubt that Obama's made it very, very clear that he would not tolerate that. And despite talks about the tail wagging the dog, when it comes down to the real important issues that really affect the national security interests of the United States, as you saw with Eisenhower in '56 and Reagan, the AWACS sale, Carter in '78, Lebanon. I give several other examples, but when the U.S. puts its foot down, AIPAC may scream, but they can't change the policy. But what about all this talk about war that the Israelis were talking about a month or so ago? Remember that? Well, according to most Israeli leftists I've talked to, what was happening when he was talking about this? That was when they were having those massive street demonstrations against economic austerity and housing, education, et cetera, their own equivalent of the Occupy movement, only relative to the population, was much, much bigger. And the one obvious area to cut spending is the military. And basically the Netanyahu started talking about, that's when they started talking about the rhetoric of war in Iraq. How can you cut military spending when we're about to have a war? So that was more for internal Israeli consumption, I think, the reality. At the same time, let me conclude by saying that even though I don't think it's likely, there's always a risk, as we saw with the nuclear arms race and a lot of other things, that even if they don't plan to go to war, when you prepare for war, when you threaten to war, when you create the ideological, prepare people for war, all these kind of ways, sometimes something can come up and makes it difficult to stop. In fact, the House just passed a bill that specifically forbids the administration from having any diplomatic contact with Iran. This is the first time in history, even in wartime, that Congress has prevented the White House or the State Department or anybody else from having diplomatic contact with another country. And it was passed by an overwhelming bipartisan majority. Now, there is a proviso that says, you can, the president can make an exception if he contacts the members of the appropriate committees 15 days ahead of time. But most crises, you can't wait 15 days. The whole Cuban Missile Crisis was only 13 days. They'd be nervous about, Darren Wells, some Republican congressman, leak it to Fox News, and, it would, basically, for all intents and purposes, it is a ban. And this waiver of 15 days or whatever really doesn't count. So there is, so again, though I don't think that's the plan, there is still that risk, and still it's important why we need to mobilize and why we need to prevent another U.S. war in the Middle East. Thank you.